Welcome to the Family Financial Conversation, an Advisorpedia-powered podcast about the decisions families make as they age that involve money, but might revolve around very different things. Listen in for thoughts from industry experts on getting the best possible outcomes from those decisions through the lens of great financial advice. We are all entering this age of longevity together. Let's begin.
Welcome, everybody, again to the Family Financial Conversation. I'm your host, Tom West, with my fantastic co-host, Suzanne Schmitt. And remember, audience, I'm coming to you as a financial advisor myself, a practitioner who's got to slug through a career's worth of stresses and opportunities with trying to get retention and organic growth sort of top of mind as I'm looking at my own practice for the course of this year. And Suzanne, as an industry expert in all things aging and trying to get advisors like me oriented and pointed in the right direction about the big trends that are affecting our country, our clients, and our industry. So welcome, everybody. And Suzanne, welcome again. And tell us a little bit about what we're going to be exploring today.
Absolutely. Pleasure to be here. And thank you for the warm welcome. So we're going to be talking today about, I hesitate to say it's a phenomena, but the notion of solo aging. And I think it's going to be important for us, for this audience specifically, to unpack what does that actually mean, right? What are the implications to you as an advisor? And what are some emerging opportunities? So maybe we could start, Tom, with going into what does it mean to be a solo ager?
Yeah, I mean, initially, solo aging, I'm usually thinking of somebody that might be a widow or might not have a family, but that might be a little bit too narrow of an understanding. So to scope this out for me, what are we talking about with solo aging?
So I think it's important for us to dispel the myth that solo aging is something that is confined, quote unquote, just to those folks that never got married. In fact, I think we would probably both argue, or maybe we wouldn't, that we are all going to be solo agers at some point. So solo agers absolutely apply to those folks that have never gotten married, could also, though, apply to folks that have gotten divorced, or people who have never had kids, or people that are estranged from their kids. And, in thinking about this topic, I think it's really important to note that roughly 27% of people in this country are estranged from their family, and at least 1 in 10 are estranged parents to child. So when you start to think about it that way, you could argue that solo aging actually encompasses the vast majority of most advisors' books.
Sure. Now, when you're thinking about solo aging, Suzanne, like I'm the place that I always start with in the concept of aging is sort of on a timeline. Like I'm advancing through different chapters of my life and my abilities and my relationships and whatnot. Are there particular dimensions of solo aging that you think a financial advisor needs to be spending some acute attention on?
Yeah, I think there's really 3 distinct categories, Tom. So I'm going to start with the first one, and that is as clients turn 50. There is a plethora of research that says when folks turn 50, they start to get much more serious about aging, and they are starting to experience those chronic conditions that ultimately and unfortunately oftentimes are the causes of our deaths. So not to start off on a negative note, but 50 is a really helpful trigger for advisors to hone in on and start to have more, I'll say, planful conversations with clients about what does the potential for living and aging alone look like, and how could the client think about that in a way with the advisor's input that's constructive, so age 50. The second set of circumstances I think that are really important for us to talk about are life events. And we know that life events tend to cause roughly 2/3 of consumers to engage with their advisor. So life event could take the form of becoming a caregiver, major job change, certainly divorce, or obviously loss of a spouse. So those are all opportunities that I think are really critical to have the solo aging conversation with your advisor around, but also obviously touches things like estate planning, protection, guaranteed income, investing, et cetera. And then the final category, and this perhaps is the one that can be the most challenging, is how do or should people think about aging in situations where they may be married or coupled, same-sex or heterosexual, but in the anticipation of a partner's divorce. So I would categorize, or I should say death and or divorce. I would categorize those three instances as really important opportunities for individuals to be thinking about on their own and really partnering more deeply with their advisors on to think about what a good plan and a good team looks like, because we know the advisor can be kind of the quarterback of that team, but the advisor can't do everything by him or herself.
Right, right. In my mind, having served solo agers a number of different ways, I found that early in my career, I think I made a mistake by assuming people that found themselves by themselves in different aspects of their lives were very similar. I think when I was a younger man, an advisor, with sort of a nuclear family structure sort of imprinted on my head as sort of a default structure that everybody that didn't fall into that category probably had a huge amount in common. And that's not the case at all. I mean, I think that what you, I think, appropriately talked about was solo aging is an experience that many, perhaps most of us, are going to touch on different aspects of over the course of our lives. And it's as dynamic as anything else. It's not like a rigid category that people get assigned, that people are falling into. Much is in common across all solo agers. But there are some areas that, from an advisor standpoint, in terms of points of access, can you talk a little bit about maybe some of these dimensions a little bit more narrowly? What are some of the areas that advisors need to start paying attention to, where their clients might be transitioning into or find themselves in a circumstance that could impact their financial decision making?
Yeah, happy to. Before I answer that, though, you piqued my interest with your observation of how you've grown into an understanding that all solo agers don't look and feel the same. I'd love to know, before I answer the question you just posed, how you came to that understanding.
So my head initially goes to this lady who was one of my first clients. So for the audience, like early in my career, I started out in long-term care insurance and found some success before pivoting over to wealth management. And so there was this bridge period of time where I was very interested in some of the families that I was meeting that were very interested in long-term care insurance because they were uninsurable, because they had a chronic illness or a cognitive impairment or whatnot. So I ended up exploring this whole aspect of aging with lessened ability. And there was a lady, Suzanne, that I met in that circumstance who was a widow and had been a widow for a really long period of time. And her name was Ellie. And Ellie was kind of funny. She was sort of a pistol. And after I sold her long-term care insurance and was managing some of her money, she was always very self-deprecating about, now that I'm doing all this by myself, I got to figure this out by myself and whatnot. And I would start quipping with her a little bit, like, and me, and I'm on your team. And then she started rounding out that, like, well, I've got other folks that are kind of in this same situation. I've got a friend, Ruth. I've got a friend, George. And we're kind of doing all this stuff alone together. And I started asking a whole bunch of questions like, well, if you don't know exactly how, what's going to happen next, how is it that you make decisions, without maybe a real formal family relationship or maybe an obvious person to pick up successor decision making? She said two things that were interesting. She said, well, it's important to recognize that we can all do this alone together, and that by being sort of forthright with the things that are important to folks that might have some influence in supporting me down the road. And I had my advisor moment. Like, one of my advisor moments was with Ellie. I said, like, well, I'm going to be happy to be able to help you with that. And she said, like, how exactly are you going to help? And I remember this conversation that was formative. And I said, well, I guess I can help everybody, do the things that are most important to you. And she said, well, how do you know what's most important to me? I told her, well, you're going to tell me. So she has this funny look on her face. I remember this. And I had a good relationship with her, and I was able to challenge her a little bit. It's like, okay, do you trust me to challenge you a little bit? I'm like, yeah, okay. How about I'll give you 90 seconds to tell this group of people that are supporting you as a solo ager everything that they need to know to get started. But after those 90 seconds, you can't tell them anything. And you can take some notes, you can prepare, but hold on my cell phone. It was still at a timer back, and I said, when you're ready to start talking, I'm going to push this, and it's 90 seconds, then you got to stop. And that was one of my favorite young advisor moments, because she was kind of floored, like, well, I gotta think about it. And like, well, who am I supposed to? So she did her part and she took some notes. And I remember she said a few things. She's like, okay, here's where my passwords are. Here's where my keys are. The card doesn't work. I've got a cousin that's going to come in that's named on all the power of attorney, and she's a giant pain in the neck. And you have to listen to her, and she's going to tell you that you can't tell her what to do, and then you have to tell her exactly what to do. Like, and she did this in 90 seconds, and it was all done. And then we laughed about it, like, see, this is how I'm going to be the keeper of this set of priorities that ultimately financial decisions are going to be made by. So I didn't know I was going to tell the story. Thanks for the prompt. But 2 or 3 years later, she ended up having some health problems and wasn't able to speak for herself. She had a friend, Ruth, who I met for the first time. And Ruth, 2 years later, she says, "Oh, you're her advisor, Tom West. Like, so let me tell you how I know who you are. Years ago, Ellie took us out for dinner and made us all stop talking and said, in 90 seconds, tell everybody what everybody needs to know." And we go through all of the stuff with Ellie, and she ends up being pretty pivotal, Ruth does, in terms of helping make decisions on Ellie's behalf. And, I always like, as an advisor, trying to bring back any of these stories to retention or organic growth. Ruth, in complimenting me with helping out with Ellie's stuff, she says, "Yeah, we're going to have to meet again next week." I'm like, "Well, I think we did everything for Ellie." She said, "Yeah, but my stuff is a disaster. And looking at what we're doing with Ellie and making sure that I've got a connection between the things that are important and actually consolidating stuff and streamlining a bunch of loose ends. Like, I'm in the same situation as Ellie does, and you're going to have to walk me through some of my stuff." So I remember in particular how I arrived at that was meeting a handful of solo agers that had a few things in common. The discoverability, what I've always been talking about on this podcast, of having the capacity to deeply profile your clients and having that as sort of an ingrained habit, part of the professional discipline. That's what got me into the right frame of mind with Ellie. But as I learned more about other solo agers and how very different they are, what are the commonalities and what are the differences, that's how I started paying attention to this concept with a lot more rigor and focus.
What a great story and what a great formative experience. And, you asked prior to that, to my question, what are some of the risks? And I'm going to start with one that you just raised, and that is not knowing who the quote unquote trusted contacts are or the other members of the team. And what a great way to get to know family members, to potentially, to your point, from a growth standpoint, start to pull those family members into the conversation versus the risk that you run as an advisor when you don't make those connections and you don't tend to take advantage of proactively, perhaps touching on who the trusted contacts are. Most of them are going to have advisors who may be looking to swoop in and create a relationship with their extended network. So you, in a very proactive way, connected not just with your client, but with her circle of friends, and hopefully did her circle of friends some real good to mitigate risks in their lives, clearly, which is a great story. But I think there's an emerging category of risk that a lot of advisors who work as RIAs or individual practices don't always think about. And that is what's happening with the insurance carriers and what's happening with the retirement carriers who are providing services to clients who are still in the workforce. And by that, I mean, there has been a proliferation of programs in the last several years around caregiving, around life events, around financial well-being, that while they offer some phenomenal content and do some education that, to be frank, a lot of advisors don't have the bandwidth to do en masse. The flip side is the programs are offered in service of those firms then deepening or establishing relationships with your clients. And the reality is, for most people, workplace, specifically their 401k or their retirement plans, as well as their benefit plans, tend to be frequented sites, top of mind type concepts for those consumers. So I raise those in the context of this conversation because they're aware of this opportunity and they are very well poised because they've got that mind share and the frequency of contact with your clients to get in front of your relationship and potentially derail or weaken that relationship. So I think it's a place that advisors, especially in the space of solar aging, really need to spend a little bit more time on. And if I could, one last point, solo agers as a rule are highly educated, highly compensated folks that are very well networked with each other. So the notion of not getting in front of these kinds of clients you really, I think, as an advisor, run the risk of they're well networked. And your story, Unrehearsed, is a prime example of what happens when an advisor can get that relationship right and builds his or her practice as a result of getting that relationship right and asking the right question. What's important to you?
Mm-hmm. So like I'm wearing my advisor hat, and I'd like to tell you where my antenna went off on your story. Well, my antenna were off is like other media, industry related media is already in contact with my clients and your clients' audience about this stuff. And I don't think it's a big secret that solo agers probably know they're solo agers. So they're probably more attuned to be receptive to what is being positioned out there as appropriate resources, as appropriate trusted contacts, places to go, trusted institutions and whatnot. And there's a big risk from a retention standpoint if this is unaddressed. I can share with you what some of the language that I use when I am winning business from other advisors. Sometimes these new clients that I have like feel bad that they're leaving their old advisor, but for whatever reason, like I was in the right place at the right time, speaking to the priorities or circumstances better. And I still do. I tell them this: tell your old advisor that they were great for me for the chapter in their lives where I was then, but that's not where I am now. I'm in the new place and I need a new advisor to help me out in the new place. And if everybody in the audience sort of buys into, like Suzanne, yours and mine's big thesis is most people procrastinate. And when something happens, all of a sudden everything shifts at the same time as compared to slowly unfolds according to a masterful life plan. We just have to anticipate that folks in every category, solo aging in particular, are going to be extra sensitive to being mindful on when to react to go to a new direction because of things you talked about. They're educated. They're probably a little bit more networked with other folks in the same situation. But I think that retention angle is just as important as the happy ending of my Ellie story, which was a good organic growth story.
Exactly. I think the other thing that's interesting and something advisors should be wary of is solo by choice versus solo by chance. They tend to, as you said, have strong networks, but very different networks and very different satisfaction levels with their teams. So said in other ways, solo agers who are intentional and have been that way perhaps their entire life are happier with their teams. They have cultivated those relationships. They tend to have stronger plans in place. And when you contrast that with folks, honestly, like the majority of us who will become sole agers likely because of a death or a divorce, those are the folks that tend to make more radical decisions in the moment of the life event that has prompted them to become a sole ager. And to the point that, we were both making previously, there are a lot of, mechanisms out there in the marketplace to really exploit people in those moments and take them away from otherwise trusted advice relationships. So something both, to look at as I think as an opportunity from an advisor's perspective, but also just want to heighten that risk because there has been such a concerted effort, particularly in the workplace, to really wrap people with life event support, including advice and guidance in those moments. And we know that, unfortunately, people who are under duress are not always going to make the best long-term decisions in the moment.
What a great jumping off point, because I know what I want to give our advisor audience members. Like I always like to give them something to do after they learn a perspective or not. And, usually it's going to go in the direction of, hey, maybe you take a different kind of a look at your existing clients. So, predictably, I was going to go down the path of, why don't you profile your book of business and start identifying solo agers in particular? And, even though you might just have thought of this for the first time, solo aging can be, estranged family, distant family. If somebody doesn't, work in a nuclear family to answer the question, who do you call at 3 a.m? Who's got the keys to your house, that sort of stuff. But Suzanne, what you've done, and I think this is a huge benefit to the audience, is you've actually split that solo ager profile, I think, in a real positive way for financial advisors that really want to sink their teeth into this enormous opportunity and risk. Then what you've done is basically solo agers by choice or solo agers by circumstance. And where I've got, a pretty significant amount of expertise is when financial priorities change radically because of circumstances, unwelcome circumstances, a lot of times outside of an individual's control, where housing or healthcare or death or cognitive issues or things like that sometimes reset clients, and they encounter conflicts with their old priorities and their new circumstances. And, we're going to be spending a lot of time on our podcast, The Family Financial Conversation, here on Advisorpedia in that space. But that's not the same as solo agers by choice. I think that solo agers by choice, you can be a whole lot more deliberate and less breathless as an advisor, being able to round out a value proposition where you can become a whole lot more inclusive with how their plan plays out for them and not be an unexpected bystander. And that's different than the way that advisors need to act for decision makers that find themselves alone through circumstances not of their choosing.
Absolutely. And I think the benefit, we'll start with the solo by choice community. A couple things. One, they knew this was coming, meaning they knew that they were ultimately always going to have to put that team together. Generally, those solo by choice folks tend to be more planful. So from a networking opportunity, they tend to, all solo agers, right, tend to lean on each other, but solo by choice tend to lean on each other more. And when you look at the research around solo by choice, they cultivate networks of friends, basically, with very similar lifestyle choices. So the potential there to have teams in place, as you alluded to not be acting in moments of crisis, to have the runway to be more planful is phenomenal. But you could also argue that's a tremendous pool of professional people who have advanced planning, advice, and guidance needs that you can start to tap into on the off chance that they are looking for somebody who, I'll borrow your phrase, maybe they had somebody in their life that was right for them in that moment, but they've moved forward in their life and they're looking to get a different perspective. So it's a great community who also tends to be vocal and high from a net promoter score, proponents of sharing the contact information of the advisors with whom they work, who are really pleased. The second point I would make about them is they tend to work a little bit longer. And so from an advisor's perspective, the runway that those individuals have between when they end their work life, transition oftentimes into consulting work, and ultimately retire with a capital R tends to be a longer runway. So it is a richer need base and a richer relationship for the average advisor as compared to, unfortunately, folks who might find themselves single by virtue of circumstance, and oftentimes circumstance that can unfold very, very quickly.
Right. So, one thought of encouragement for our advisor listeners, being able to serve solo agers, this is something that we all can do. First off, I want to point out, you're already doing it right now. If you're having active conversations about how financial decisions relate to priorities, you're already in there right now. What Suzanne and I want to do is we want to sort of widen the aperture of your focus to start being a little bit more aware of the unique circumstances of your client. Like, we're always talking about rediscovery. Solo aging by choice, solo aging by circumstance can take individuals down different paths of how they make decisions, how they make financial decisions, and how they make family financial decisions. I think the idea of profiling your existing book, categorizing solo agers perhaps by choice or by circumstance, and then really reflecting on how you can meet your clients sort of where they are and where they might go, can be hugely impactful on your career and the outcomes that you bring to your clients. So, Suzanne, we're coming up on time. If you could have one takeaway thought for our audience members thinking about solo aging, what's the takeaway thought that you want to close with today?
Solo aging isn't a depressing prospect. And from an advisor's perspective, I would hope that advisors don't think of it as something that we should be ashamed of or feel badly about when we're engaging with people who are solo by circumstance or solo by choice. I actually think that as somebody who is fully cognizant that she is likely to be a solo ager, I would welcome more people approaching it in a very direct and pragmatic fashion. So I would say, Tom, I would just really encourage advisors not to be afraid to bring it up. I think clients would actually be relieved.
Yeah, I think Thank you for that. And that certainly is the sense that I got with Ellie. And there's in responding to that, Suzanne, there's so many different ways to connect. When you were talking, I think that the question that I've had some success with in my career, and I think it particularly pertains to solo agers. Think of my client Ellie. Ellie, if there was one thing that you could change about your support network now or down the road, she'll tell you. And that's the pain point. Like, don't outsmart yourself, advisor, audience person. Like, support that thing. It's the pitch down the middle. But listen, with that thought, we're going to break. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for Solo Aging, the Family Financial Conversation. Please keep tuning into us at advisorpedia.com. We certainly enjoyed our time together sharing a few thoughts with you. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Family Financial Conversation podcast. The information covered in the posted represents the views and opinions of the guests and do not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Signature Estate and Investment Advisors. Disclosure: Signature Estate and Investment Advisors, LLC, is an SEC-registered investment advisor. However, such registration does not imply a certain level of skill or training, and no inference to the contrary should be made. Securities offered through Signature Estate Securities, Inc., member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through SEIA, LLC, 2121 Avenue of the Stars, Suite 1600, Los Angeles, California, 90016. Telephone number 310-712-2323.